Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire's Business of America podcast with your host, Jerry Rogers.
Welcome to another edition of the Business of America. And from past programs, you know we have on innovators, scientists, entrepreneurs, advocates, small business owners, the men, the women in the arena doing things, making the public discussion move forward, making the economy move forward, making science move forward. And so today, it's a great thrill. It's an honor for me to welcome our guest. His resume is beyond impressive. Right now, I know he's a fellow at the Academy for Science and Freedom at Hillsdale College, which is a beacon for truth and the search for truth at Hillsdale. Former professor of medicine at Harvard University, Harvard Medical School. He served at the FDA, the CDC, NIH. He was a health policy advisor to Governor DeSantis. So Martin Kulldorff, welcome to the Business of America.
Thank you so much for having me, Jerry. I appreciate it.
It's my great pleasure. I just said to you off mic, jack of all trades, master of none. I have a radio program that I've been hosting for almost 8 years. And we were on air in the midst of COVID. And when the lockdowns were becoming normalized, and when it became dangerous for your position to say, well, wait a second, is this the best science or health approach? And I get pulled into the program director's office and saying, Jerry, are you sure you want to be saying this? When mandates came down, there were people who were out in the forefront offering up different viewpoints based on science, based on their experience. And I know you are one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. And again, when I was on the air in my writing during COVID, it was the Great Barrington Declaration that I would lean on to explain that we have to listen to the scientists and not the politicians. Can you tell us a little bit about the Great Barrington Declaration?
Yeah, so if we go back almost 5 years now when the pandemic started, it was a shock to me in the spring or late like March of 2020, because for COVID, we threw the basic principles of public health out the window. So that was a shock to me as a public health scientist, as an epidemiologist, as a biostatistician. And the only exception in the Western world was Sweden, who sort of followed the principles of public health. And some of those principles are that you cannot just think about one disease. You have to think about health as a whole. You can't just think about COVID. You also have to say, well, if you close the hospitals, or if you then what happens to people who have cardiovascular problems? Well, many died at home because they didn't go to the hospital. What happens to cancer screening and cancer treatment? Well, cancer incident actually went down in 2020. It wasn't because people didn't have cancer, just that it wasn't detected. And if it's not detected, you can't treat it. We have mental health. When you lock down people and they have to be at home and they can't be with friends or see family or go to church or going to the bingo hall or whatever people do, then that's not good for mental health. And of course, closing schools. Schools are important for education. And you can't just close schools for a year and think that has no effect on children. And obviously it did, both on their academic performance as well as on their social life. So we now know that test scores went down because of these school closures.
And there was an increase in mental health issues and all kinds of health issues, health related issues to our young people.
Yes. So in public health, you have to look at it, all the health. Also, you can't just look at it this week or this month. You have to look into the future. So if you don't do the cancer screening and cancer treatment, that's not going to increase cancer deaths this year. But somebody who would have survived 15 years may now die 5 or 6 years from now. So you have to also have the long perspective. And the other principle of public health is that public health is for everybody in society. So lockdowns sort of protected what we call the laptop class, people who could work from home with the laptop, while ordinary working people, they still have to go out there and deliver the pizzas to those people working at home and so on.
So, folks at the grocery stores, many people, and again, a lot of these folks who were still engaged in the economy, if they weren't fired, if their businesses weren't shut down, small businesses shut down, big box stores were allowed to stay open. It seemed that science or health was yes, it was given fanfare, but it seemed to be secondary. In other words, it was easier to close down a small florist shop or a small hardware shop or restaurants versus shutting down big corporate stores. How much did politics play in some of the healthcare decisions around the pandemic?
Well, what I can say is that public health played a very little role because it went against us. We can blame it on politics, we can blame it on fear, or there might be other things we can blame it on, but certainly we didn't follow basic principles of public health.
You know, that's an interesting thing because you're 100% correct about this. And I've had on this program Dr. Marty McCary. I've had Eric Hargan, who was Deputy Secretary at HHS, and they've said the same thing. That the protocols and at Johns Hopkins, there was a pandemic plan. And Dr. McCary said, we did the opposite of what was in the pandemic plan. Eric Hargan, who's hardly a right winger or a flamethrower in terms of the public discussion, was talking about how we have to wrap our minds around best practices, what to do with vaccines, how to deal with seniors versus children, and these sorts of things. But the question is, a lot of those contrarian voices, and pardon the term, but during this time, the contrarian voices seemed to be isolated or pushed out or worse, censored. So
in the spring and summer of 2020, there were many of us who tried to speak up. I tried to publish things in the US media. I was not very successful. I'm a native of Sweden, so I was able to publish op-eds in the major Swedish daily newspapers supporting the Swedish approach because they were under attack internationally. So I figured they need some support for what they're doing because they did the right approach. But in the US, it was hard until in August, I finally was able to publish in CNN Espanol. I know how to write Spanish. So I figured since I can't publish it in English, I publish it in English language.
So the Swedish scientist, in order to make his case, had to write a piece, not in English, but in Spanish.
CNN did not want it. CNN English did not want it. So what happened then in October, on October 4th, so actually 4 years ago from tomorrow, I invited two very esteemed epidemiologists, Dr. Sunata Gupta from Oxford University.
Sure.
He is the preeminent infectious disease epidemiologist in the world. And Dr. J. Bhattacharya from Stanford.
Yeah. So Martin, just so you know, both of whom I have interviewed. So I know who they are and I know their minds, and these are very impressive men, scientists. So I'm sorry. Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, they are brilliant scientists, both of them, and wonderful human beings also, who really cares about the population at large. So we met in Great Barrington, which is in the Berkshires in western Massachusetts. And we did some interviews there, but we also wrote a one-page document arguing for what we call focus protection. And we call this the Great Barrington Declaration. And the argument there is that we knew from the very beginning in the early 2020 that while anybody can get infected of COVID, that there was more than 1,000-fold difference in risk in terms of death, in terms of mortality. So older people were more than 1,000 times more risk at dying than the younger people. So then it sort of becomes the obvious is that, well, we have to protect older people because they are the one at risk. But we don't have to close schools. And we knew that from Sweden because Sweden did not close the schools and daycare for kids age 1 to 15 during the spring, the height of the pandemic during the spring of 2020. And they had, among 1.8 million children, there were exactly 0 deaths and only a handful of hospitalizations. And teachers were not at higher risk than other professions. So we knew that it was perfectly safe to have schools open. So we argued that schools should be open. We shouldn't lock down. One should take certain precautions. Always good to wash your hands, etc. But we shouldn't close down society in general. Children and young adults should be able to live near normal life. But we also had to do a much better job protecting the elderly. We didn't do that.
No. In fact, Martin, we stacked them up in buildings and nursing homes with no outside ventilation, just circulated air inside, with the tragedies in New York and elsewhere. But I mean, it seems that what we did with the elderly is the opposite of what we should have done. We kind of locked them up in these almost cell-like structures.
Yeah, the worst thing that that was done to them in New York and some other states was that they come to the hospital, they get better, and then they are sent back to the nursing homes to infect all the other older people in that nursing home. That was basically killing people doing that. So that's was outrageous. But there were also other things. There's a lot of staff rotation in the nursing homes. So you can't avoid death 100%. You can't eliminate that, but you can minimize it. And one way to minimize it is to minimize staff rotation. So instead of having an old 90-year-old woman encountering 24 different staff during a week, if we can reduce it to 5, that reduces the risk of her being exposed. We did a lot of testing for the disease in colleges. That was useless. Or for contact tracing, that was a waste of money. We should have done more testing in the nursing homes of the both staff and visitors. And that didn't increase until finally at the end of the summer of 2020, Scott Atlas, who was then helping out in the White House, he was pushing through more testing in the nursing homes. But for a long time, that did not happen. So there were many things that we could have done to do better protection of older people who were at high risk. So we failed it. So on October 4, 2020, Dr. Gupta and Bhattacharya, we wrote this Great Barrington Declaration, and then we posted it, and we had some colleagues who sort of co-signed it, and then we had anybody could sign it. So we have tens of thousands of scientists and healthcare workers who signed it, and in total there was over 900,000 eventually. Wow. So that took off, and I think what happened was that previously, when I tried to speak, or Jay or Sonetra or somebody else, we were dismissed like, "Oh, that's just one person, and that person is not really have the credential, or they're not really from a good place or whatever." So the fact that there were 3 of us, and we all card-carrying infectious disease epidemiologists, having done infectious disease epidemiology for a long time, and we all came from reasonably respectable universities, made it impossible to ignore. And that's what happened. So even the sort of the hostile media had not had to sort of write about it. And many of it was very hostile, but they usually had a link to the declarations that said, yes, that's good, because people are smart. They will read it, and then they will click on that link, and they will actually read the declaration, and they will see, this actually makes sense.
Now, it's interesting because you're right, and the Great Barrington Declaration made perfect sense. However, there was this great pushback from the, for lack of a better term, the mainstream of media, but also public health. We know that the public health community is important to good health outcomes. And during the pandemic, when public health entities followed the science, there were good outcomes. When they followed the politics or the fear or whatever outside of science and health, the pandemic response went sideways. So I have a two-part question, and that is, why the backlash against the declaration from those, for lack of a better term, mainstream? But the more important question or follow-up to that is, how does public health, because we need the FDA, we need the CDC, we need the NIH, we need ACIP, we need these entities. They're important to public health. How do they begin to win back trust, public trust?
Those are two very good questions. And I think there is a problem with trust now because the leadership, both political and scientific leadership, they went for the lockdowns. And Sweden was an exception. And we now have the result. If you look at excess death, which is the sort of the best measure to see how well a country did, in the Western world, Sweden has the lowest excess deaths during the pandemic. And it has among the lowest COVID death, but the lowest excess death. So we know now that the focus protection was the right approach, following the principles of public health. So then why was there such a backlash? I don't know. There seems to be a less of a tolerance for different viewpoints and a tendency to want to censor or silence or slander. So, for example, soon after the Great Barrington Declaration came out, in email communication between the NIH director, Francis Collins, and Anthony Fauci, they were talking about there needed to be a devastating takedown on the Great Barrington Declaration.
So, what I have a hard time wrapping my head around, and I've been involved in politics for 3 decades, and I understand left versus right, Republican versus Democrat, progressive versus libertarian. I get it. I understand. But there seems to be from multi-quarters, from all quarters, that is, attempts to censor. You know, we have right now Republicans are trying to censor social media platforms in the name of protecting children. You have former Senator John Kerry talking about the First Amendment being a threat. But what I don't understand, Martin, is how was the work, the Great Barrington Declaration, how was it a threat? Why couldn't it just be included in the public discussion so we'd have better health outcomes?
Yeah, that's a good question. And years ago, there was a consensus about the First Amendment and the benefit of public discussions of things. I guess Anthony Fauci and company did not want anybody to contradict what they were saying. And since they didn't have any good arguments, Anthony Fauci is not a public health person, he's a lab scientist. Since they wasn't able to argue with the facts, instead they tried silencing and slander.
So Martin, let me ask you this. Were they successful? What I mean by that is this. I know that during COVID, voices were silenced. There were censorship on social media platforms. People were banned. I know that all happened. But here you are today, and you're still going at it. And the fact of the matter is, the CDC, the NIH, ACIP, ACIP still needs to offer solid advice and counsel and recommendations on vaccines. We're still having the public discussion. So are we getting better? Have we learned our lessons, or are things the same or worse? We're moving backwards. What do you think?
No, I don't think things are getting better.
I'm a despairing optimist, Martin. I wanted some hope. So things aren't getting better.
Not when
Talk
it
about
comes
that.
to open scientific discourse, and they're still censoring. I think Jay Bhattacharya was censored by YouTube just yesterday or 2 days ago, a podcast. So that's still ongoing. Now, what did get better is that we eventually sort of won the debate. It took a long time. It was hard and it was slow, but there's nobody has arguing that it was correct to close schools, for example. People are recognizing that the public health damage for cardiovascular disease, mental health, cancer, and diabetes, and so on are strong. So there's more and more recognition that these lockdowns was a public health disaster. And I think that will continue that. But that was a long and slow process.
I mean, so for and I know that we should be concerned about the next pandemic, the next disease that we don't know anything about yet. That's why science innovation. That's why the free exchange of ideas is so important, because we don't know what's coming around the curve. So my question to you is, will we do better in terms of the whole pandemic? If there's a pandemic, God forbid, will we do better next time? Will we not go to the shutdowns and such things?
There will be a next pandemic. We have had pandemics throughout world history for thousands of years. We don't know if it'll be 5 years from now or 50 years from now or when, but there will be more pandemics. And my hope is that we will do better, because there is a recognition, for two reasons. There is a recognition that we failed during this pandemic. I think that's an increasing recognition. And as the older people who are in charge sort of retire, younger people come up who were not responsible for it, I think they have an open mind. And there's a saying in science that science progresses one funeral at a time. So sometimes you have to have the old people die away before the new ideas comes in. But the other reason, I think, is people were taken by surprise 5 years ago, or 4.5 years ago. So there was no organized opposition to this lunacy of lockdowns. And it took time to build that sort of coalition that could push back. Because those who went for lockdowns, they were well connected with the leaders at NIH and CDC and the different scientific journals and the journal science journalists and so on. So they were very well connected. So they had a head start. Well, it took much longer for the rest of us who wanted to follow the principles of public health to sort of
what took you so long, Martin? Why did it take? I'm only joking. Let me ask you this, because I know that you have served in the public health community, FDA, CDC, NIH. I believe you were a member of ACIP, the policy group at CDC that recommends vaccine recommendations.
I was a member of a subgroup of ACIP, not ACIP itself, but they put together a subgroup to look into the safety of the COVID vaccines. So I was a member of that subgroup.
So I say all that to ask this question. Vaccine science, again, is critical to public health. And unfortunately, because of how we handled mandates and the COVID response, there is a still very negative perception reaction to vaccine science. How can we better communicate? How can the public health community better communicate the importance of vaccines?
Well, do you know who are the biggest anti-vaxxers?
Who are they?
The vaccine fanatics.
The ones who are over the top.
Yes. So the people who want to force vaccine mandates, for example. People who claims that all vaccines are safe and that everybody should get the COVID vaccine, for example. Those are the biggest, or those who claim that the COVID vaccines would, like the former CDC director, who claimed that the COVID vaccine will stop transmission. So those who are vaccine fanatics, who sort of go over the top and say things that are not true about vaccines, those are the biggest anti-vaxxers. They have caused a lot of vaccine hesitancy during the last 3 years, much more than the previous generation of people who were questioning vaccines. So we have to be honest about vaccines. And in my view, vaccines are great. They save lives and they help reduce diseases. I mean, the smallpox vaccine by itself saved countless of lives. So, but that doesn't mean that there's sometimes problems with vaccines. And sometimes you have a vaccine that maybe needs to be withdrawn from the market. There was one called Shield some years ago. And then if you look at the COVID vaccine, the mandates, they should never have been mandated. And we should have done focused protection on the older people.
Yeah.
So it was, in my view, and then this crazy idea saying that if you've already had COVID, then you have better immunity than you have from the vaccine. So this doesn't make any sense to mandate COVID vaccine for people who already had COVID. And nurses were fired.
Sure.
And other healthcare workers were fired for not taking the vaccine because they already had COVID. So they already had superior immunity. And we've known about this natural immunity or infection-acquired immunity for almost 2,500 years, since 430 BC, since the Athenian plague.
So this was very basic science. We knew this for thousands of years.
Yes.
I don't mean to laugh. It's just, it seems to me that we got into these political debates and there was no use for them. There was no reason for them. And again, I'm trying to figure out, how does the public health community, how does the innovative community, biopharma, how do they come back from all this?
I think it will be very, very hard to do that. And it takes a lot of honesty. And I think it takes a situation where those people who evaluate vaccines, like ACIP or at the FDA, have no connections to pharma. Well,
that's an interesting question, right? Because
it's going to take a long, long time.
Before we close out, because I know your time is precious. I know that you are, and again, if this is something that is not public yet, then just we'll stop me and we'll cut it out of the program. But there is an event coming up at Stanford that you're part of that I'm excited about, and also there's talk about a new science journal that you are shepherding. Can you talk a little bit about both?
So the conference is tomorrow at Stanford.
Yep.
So we talked about the problem during the pandemic, that there was no discussion about different strategies, what there should have been. So actually the conference tomorrow at Stanford is 4.5 years too late. But it is actually a conference where people who had different views during the pandemic will come together and discuss it. So Jay Bhattacharya will be there, Sunata Gupta will be there, Scott Atlas will be there, Anders Tegnell, who was the state epidemiologist in Sweden, will be there, as well as people like Andrew Neumer, for example, who were in favor of lockdowns. So there will be, so hopefully there will be a good discussion. In terms of the journal, that's a project together with Real Clear, which I'm very excited about.
Yes.
It's a non-profit journal called the Journal of the Academy of Public Health. And the problem during the pandemic was that it was very difficult, even in journals, to have any views that did not follow the established narrative, the prevailing narrative. So there was a lack of open discussion even at the journal area. So we want to set up a different type of journals where it is possible to have more open discourse. And for example, instead of having anonymous peer review, we can have open peer review so that the readers can actually see what the peer reviewer said about the journal articles.
Open discussion, transparency, no censorship, hearing the best arguments from those who you oppose, not objectifying your political opponents or your scientific opponents. This all sounds like a recipe for how we come back from going sideways during the pandemic. Censorship is a very serious problem, not just in science, but in the public discourse broadly. And much of it's coming from the left. However, the right and the allies on the right also engage in this. And again, I not to get you to comment on this, but Republicans in the Senate, in the House, are pushing a censorship bill to censor online internet content that will become a political leverage against your political opponents. So your approach is the best approach. And maybe I can coin a new phrase, the Kulldorff approach to public policy and public health, where there's open discussion, where you hear what the other person is saying or scientist is saying. We will link to whatever you have in terms of this conference, Real Clear Health, Real Clear Policy, here at the Federal Newswire and the Business of America. And I too, I'm very much looking forward to the journal, and it's going to have a trickle down impact. So places like Real Clear Health will be able to take some of what is being discussed and reviewed, and then put it out for the media and for those involved in public policy. So these are important endeavors, and congratulations on both.
Yeah, so that's important, because when we write science articles, we write it in a very scientific language and so on, with statistical analysis and so on. So it's really great sort of for those articles that have an important public message for the public. It's really great for Really Clear Health to pick up those. That won't be all the articles, but
No.
maybe 20% of them has much broader interest, and then can like a journalist who are better at writing than scientists can sort of reformulate it and present it for the public. So I think that's very exciting to have that dual sort of approach.
Yeah. Well, again, the Business of America is about the ethos is talking to the men, the women in the arena. And Martin, certainly that's where you are. This has been, for me, it's been a great conversation. I think it's the first one, though. I think after the conference, after the journal comes out, we ought to continue this conversation about science, health, and pushing back against censorship. But I want to wish you all the good fortune and blessing. And I'll give you the last word before we say goodbye to the audience.
No, thank you so much, Jerry, for having me on. And the First Amendment, when that was written, it was written after the U.S. had gone through a very, very tumultuous time with the War of Independence. So it was written. So the framers of the Constitution, they understood that it's especially in troubled times that we need the First Amendment and free speech. And absolutely. I think that was shown also during the pandemic. That's when we have a national crisis. That's when we really need the First Amendment. If everything is fine and dandy, then fine. It's less important. It's always important, of course, but it's especially when we have a national crisis or very important things. That's when we really need the First Amendment.
Martin, thank you so much. Again, I wish you all goodwill. And consider me an ally. Consider me someone to hopefully we'll talk again in the future, and we'll let our audience know. But thank you very much to the audience. I mean, my goodness, you have it good. This is a podcast where we bring, again, these men and women who are actually doing it in the arena, whether it's science or business or entrepreneurial activity, regardless. This is what the business of America is about. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been the Federal Newswire's Business of America podcast, hosted by Jerry Rogers. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream